Hello and welcome to this month's Dolby Atmos Music Community Sessions. I'm Ben Givers, Senior Creative Relations with the Music Partnerships team at Dolby Laboratories based in Los Angeles. And in this month's session, I am super excited to be joined by two amazing mastering engineers from Neato Mastering in Nashville, Piper Payne, and from Becker Mastering in Los Angeles, Dale Becker, are going to be here to talk everything mastering in Dolby Atmos and answering your questions. So be sure to add those to the questions tab here in GoTo, and we'll get to those in a second. We talked a bit about mastering for Dolby Atmos on the last music community sessions. And in fact, we've featured several mastering engineers on these sessions going back to the start of these webinars in 2021. People such as Michael Romanowski, Emily Lazar, Colin Leonard, Mike Mansour, Pete Lyman, Andrew Mendelson, and Luke Armentrout, all wanted to expand more upon the art of mastering in these sessions and share it with you. And we'd like to do that again here today and also reinforce that mastering for Atmos is highly recommended for the same reasons as mastering in stereo. However, for Atmos, you have significantly more channels and metadata to consider. So really even more reasons to be using a specialized mastering engineer like the two that we're going to talk to here today. Piper is someone that many of you probably know from all of the amazing work that she does out in the music community, educating people about the art and importance of mastering audio, careers in audio, including with organizations like Women's Audio Mission and soundgirls.org. She's mastered an awesome EP in Dolby Atmos for the artist Madame Ghandi called the Vibrations EP. Plus, she's just opened a vinyl plant called Physical Music Products in Nashville. So super excited to have Piper here. Can't wait to talk to her and Dale Becker together, as I mentioned. Dale's mastered some of last year's biggest records in Dolby Atmos, one of those being Harry Styles' Harry's House and the really spectacular SOS by SZA as well, plus work on singles by Doja Cat that he did the year before. He's been using the Dolby Atmos album assembler as well to prepare and master albums for delivery in Dolby Atmos. So be sure to add your questions for Piper and Dale, and we'll answer them live here in a few minutes. Wanted to quickly share some exciting updates happening around Dolby Atmos music, including a new Music Studios video profile featuring Soul Asylum Studios in Atlanta, Georgia. Soul Asylum is the vision of Rafael Capone, a mix engineer who built his first studio back in 1993 around the concept of mentorship in a unique creative space where they're really focused on the community and teamwork. They're mixing Dolby Atmos music in his really cool 916 room, which is part of this massive complex with multiple studios, a rehearsal room, a live performance space, a dance studio. The place is really incredible, very special and amazing. And it was actually there where we sat down with Suave from Def Jam and mix engineer KY Engineering to see how they work together. So shout out to both of those guys and to Soul Asylum, who are doing some great work in Atlanta. Check out the video on our YouTube channel and our professional site, and check out Soul Asylum Studios online as well. If you haven't yet checked out the great video from Dolby Institute with a look at their Dolby Atmos Music Accelerator program in Miami that we mentioned a couple sessions ago, that's at dolby.com/institute and the Dolby YouTube channel. The Dolby Atmos Music Accelerator program is an educational program that gives music creatives a deep dive into the world of Dolby Atmos music creation with mentorship from music professionals and industry experts to help them create original music in Atmos, and also to help them jumpstart their careers as Dolby Atmos music creators. So the Institute page has also just been updated with music created by the artists and producers who participated in both of those accelerator programs. There's 6 songs featured there that encompass a range of styles from the pairs of artists and producers who came together to write, record, and mix their music at these accelerator programs. And you can listen to the great songs they've created and mixed at dolby.com/institute. Of course, the Institute page is also where you'll find the Dolby Atmos music curriculum, which is available in 5 languages, the in-depth creation tutorials in English and Spanish, and links to the tools downloads, links to our professional site with the knowledge base, FAQs, user forums, and user guides. You can also link to the studio onboarding site there, which features best practices for room calibration and also for delivery, and tons of other items are there as well. So check that out at professional.dolby.com, and dolby.com/institute. For tools downloads, be sure to grab the Dolby Atmos Album Assembler 1.2 version update, which includes workflow updates, optimizations, computer and OS updates, UI improvements, and support for 96K 80MB waves. You can check out a new features video at professional.dolby.com. And a shout out to Bennett, who does a lot of those videos. He's done another great one here with the Dolby Atmos Album Assembler update. We also had a deep dive tutorial with Jordan Glasgow on the Album Assembler a few sessions back, so check that out if you haven't yet. You can also grab a trial version of the new Dolby Atmos renderer and watch the community sessions with Jordan, Finn Barnes, and mix engineer John Kersey, diving into the new feature set within the renderer at our YouTube page and professional site as well. Also on the tools tip, if you haven't yet, you can also use the free Dolby PHRTF creator on your smartphone to create your personal, customized binaural monitoring profile to use with the Dolby Atmos renderer for creating Dolby Atmos music. So the Dolby PHRTF creator app used tens of thousands of data points to generate a unique profile tailored just to you. And since our individual features actually affect the way we perceive sound, your personalized head-related transfer function can improve localization, and space in headphones can be a more comfortable way to mix and listen, as well as even more accurate. So you can grab the Dolby PHRTF Creator app at professional.dolby.com, sign up for an account there if you haven't yet, and check out the beta of that great tool to use within the Dolby Atmos renderer. Okay, so on our last music community session, we had an extended post-NAMM Q&A session with folks from the Dolby Music team, answering your questions, hitting all the hot topics with Christine Thomas, Jason Banks, Aaron Venables, Jordan Glasgow, and Emma Brooks. We talked tools, studios, delivery specs, services, best practices, and a lot more. Thank you to everyone who submitted their questions for that session. Some really great topics were covered. Be sure to go back and check that one out if you haven't seen it yet. Also, we're going to do another FAQ session coming up soon, so keep your eyes out for that, and please submit your questions for that one too to musicwebinars@dolby.com. All right, let's jump into the art of mastering in Dolby Atmos with Piper Payne and Dale Becker. That'll be followed by Q&A, so make sure you add your questions here. All right, I'm very excited to be joined by two renowned mastering engineers. First from Neato Mastering and Physical Music Products, Piper Payne, and from Becker Mastering, Dale Becker. Welcome to you both, and thank you for doing this.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Ben.
So it's been a minute since we've had a mastering engineer on the sessions to share their wisdom with the community. There's been a bit of debate out in the world really for a while about mastering for Dolby Atmos. And, we spend a lot of time in the community engaging with folks to say that mastering is indeed a highly recommended step for Atmos, particularly with the additional channels and metadata, and to ensure translation really, and many other reasons, which we'll talk about here. But before we get into that, it would be great if you could please share a little bit about your backgrounds and how you got into mastering records. Piper, if we could start with you, please.
Certainly. And thanks again, Ben and Dolby, for having me. I am a mastering engineer based here in Nashville, Tennessee. I started my career originally as a classical recording engineer and ended up out in Norway and got a job in a mastering facility up there and totally fell in love with the craft of it. It's all about format conversion, so tape to vinyl, high res to CDs, stereo, and adapting all of the other formats that music is released on. But I could work on all kinds of different music every day, and that's what I fell in love with mastering. And I've been doing it for now over 15 years. So mastering has taken me a lot of places, even down into opening my own vinyl record pressing plant here in Nashville, and cutting, learning to cut lacquer. And now there's this amazing new group of formats that are out there for music release. And I've been lucky enough to work in studios that have full Atmos systems.
That's so cool. Thank you. And thank you for keeping vinyl alive as well. I'm a collector myself, and so that's a format that's near and dear to my heart. So well done. All right, Dale, give us a little about your background and how you formed Becker Mastering.
Yeah, so I grew up. I was thankful to grow up in the studio. My dad is a recording and mixing and mastering engineer, and he, throughout the years, wore different hats. And I remember kind of like being a kid and having my dad's studio in the backyard. He had an API console and two 24 track tape machines, and I just remember going in there and running around. And so it just being around the studio was, I was blessed to be around it. And as I kind of came up through college, I got a music degree, music composition, arranging, score preparation. But kind of destiny would lead me back into the studio. There was my dad's engineer at the time, uh, had to move, and so there was a session on my birthday, years ago, um, where they needed an engineer, and I had been in the studio and recording with my friends and doing projects for college and stuff, and I filled in, and that was pretty much my first day of work. Um, and then since then, we had a recording studio, full desk, everything, and a mastering room back in those days, back in Burbank. And then we decided about, I guess it would be about 16 years ago, to specialize in mastering. It was just we found a place in Pasadena that was inside of a studio, and we kind of trimmed down the recording gear and just sort of wanted to specialize, which was really what it requires to be a mastering engineer. You need, as Piper knows, you really can't do all the things. You kind of got to do the same thing every day to get good at it. And so we're and then when Dolby Atmos came out, it just seemed like a next just natural step, to want to be involved. And I was thankful to be an early adopter.
That's awesome. What a cool pathway, and congratulations on everything that you've done to get to where you are now. So very, very, very cool. So you both touched on it a little bit, but let's talk a little bit in general about what makes the mastering process so crucial, and what it is exactly that you're doing on any project, really, Atmos or stereo. But when a client's coming to you to master their work, what does that mean? Why is that so important? Piper, we could start with you. Like, touched on it a little bit, but really, what's the essence of what you're doing that's so important as well?
Yeah, it's for the uninitiated or non-audio people, it's kind of hard to explain. But for folks that are working in this industry, it should be pretty easy to understand. It's we're finishing the creative process, beginning the manufacturing and release process, and for me that means quality control. We're checking to make sure there aren't any issues with the recording that's going to be released. We're making sure that it's of course going to sound good on all systems. But it's also about converting from one format, be it a bunch of songs into an album or songs on a specific recording format out into another release format, and helping the artist through that release. Because I work with a lot of independent artists, and and even the label artists that I work with are having sometimes a little bit of a hard time understanding exactly what the steps are, because there are so many release formats available now to listen to music in. So I feel like I'm a steward and kind of helping guide them through that process. So for me, mastering is not just about making something loud or finishing it or polishing or anything so specific to the sound itself. It's more about helping into the process of the release format.
That's an important stage, right? Like, wow, that's like the last moment before the consumer hears it, right? So it's like the final touch to make sure that everything is there, which is so crucial. Yeah, Dale.
Yeah, I love that Piper said, it's about the bridge between audio and manufacturing. I feel like that's been lost in today's. That was very prevalent like early on in mastering. It was about like taking the mix, which was on tape, and getting it on. Like if we were cutting vinyl, it's about getting the mix, not to change the mix, to get as much of the mix onto the vinyl as possible. And today, you know, in mastering, it's become so much about changing things and making it loud. And I love it, you know, I love the idea of mastering being more of a preservative process where it's appropriate. It's kind of frowned upon to do a flat pass, but if the mix really sounds that great, like do a flat pass, and we could be the quality control. We could do as little as necessary if that's the correct thing to do, in terms of sound. Obviously, with the QC and everything that Piper said, we provide kind of a, since we do this every day, we have a different mindset, different way of going about things. We check things, you know, 1,000 ways, you know, to make sure that we don't deliver the thing and it not sound right when it's streaming, or it gets kicked back by label QC. The only thing I would add, I guess, would be, I always see, you know, people are like, well, why do we have to master, or why do we have to master Dolby Atmos? Especially since a lot of times people are like, well, you don't master Dolby Atmos. And that came from an early, you know, early on in the format. There really wasn't a tool set to master Dolby Atmos, and we've come so far, to the place where we can master. And at the very least, what I represent to my clients is a second set of ears, a second set of expertise. I look at things from a different angle, and oftentimes bring up things that no one thought of. You know, like, how do we make sure this streams, not only streams well, but also streams at the same volume as everything else? Yeah, a lot of people, you know, haven't sat and really hashed through what it takes to make sure things sound right once streaming. The other thing that a lot of people, because they're maybe not set up with speaker systems to mix in the format, maybe they're mixing on headphones, or maybe they started on headphones and then went in for a day into a studio, is, you know, with Piper and with myself, you can send it to a place where we have a trusted monitoring system, and not only with speakers but with headphones, so that we can make sure, no matter whether someone's listening to it on Apple Spatial, or if they're on Amazon, or if it's playing back in a home system or in a restaurant, that it's going to translate correctly. And so it's a complicated process to make sure we check all those boxes when we can.
I'll add that I have noticed that even from the beginning of the tools that we had for working on music in Atmos, you know, it was sort of like this technical conversion of, there weren't so many creative ways that we were working on. I mean, there were cool new ways of doing production, but it wasn't like so comfortable to work in that format yet, as it is now. And so now you have a lot more artists that are independent and creating their own work inside of these tools. And that is now going to turn into a bit of a Wild West thing, where mastering engineers are going, for that format, are going to become even more important, the same way that we are with, you know, independent artists or sort of DIY folks, which is amazing, working from home and having these tools available. It helps us to be that technical, you know, that like technical translation for them, so that they can be the most creative in the format, and then let us kind of help them out with making sure that it's technically going to sound great on all systems for playback.
Absolutely. And I think that's an exciting frontier where people are starting to think about how to create an immersive experience sort of from the beginning. Now that they've heard what it sounds like, they know how the tools react. The tools are more integrated into the workstations and the DAWs that they're used to using. They're starting to do creative passes from the beginning, thinking about how this is going to sound, and auditioning it, you know, right at the time of creation, which is super exciting. Um, People are always fascinated by what gear is being used and how you've built out your studios. Certainly, you each have your own unique scenarios. Dale, you've built your room in your studio around your Atmos rig. Piper, you were working most recently out of Infrasonic, where you had your stereo room and went over to your Atmos room. Dale, how'd you build out your room there, and what are you using? It's a very cool setup, a big room with a lot of space and interesting acoustic treatment. Can you take us through some of the build out there and how you implemented the system?
Yeah, so our room, I have more of we have a bit of a scrappy crew at Becker Mastering. We had to move, and I ended up in kind of a large untreated space, and at that point was only working in stereo. But it was great because when Atmos came around, I had this kind of large space to work with, and we didn't necessarily have we didn't necessarily know what we were shooting for when we started. I mean, Dolby knew, and Maurice at PMC knew, and Carrie knew. Everyone knew what they wanted to do, but in terms of like how to treat the room, how to make it, make it feel good when working in it. It was kind of a process that, and it was kind of like what was my obsession during the pandemic, because I was just working on that a lot of times late at night, just to feel like we were moving forward, still. And so we have I believe it's 13.1.6. It's all PMC. I really love the way it sounds. It was so impressive once we had Dolby come and tune the room, and we heard the first. It was actually my first proper Dolby experience, was once the speakers were set up, and because it was in the middle of the pandemic, you couldn't go and listen to something, so we set it all up, and our first experience was listening to a very famous Atmos mix, Rocket Man, and just being blown away, like it's all working. And so that's our space. We use Pro Tools and Pyramix, and we use the Atmos assembler, Dolby Atmos assembler, different stages depending on what kind of like what is needed. We also have a Neve Genesis console that we have there. It's 16 channels. It has digital in and out, so we use that as well as other gear like DW Fern and Manley stuff if we need to put an insert on a vocal. Obviously you don't have 128 channels of tube compression, but sometimes since we have 16, that'll be enough for the bed and a couple of important objects. I mean, sometimes putting a tube limiter on a vocal for the tone of it, that we can put that on the vocal. It doesn't necessarily need to be on the tambourine that's in the ceiling, so to speak. So that was one of the things that mentally I had to get around, is like, well, how am I going to get 128 channels of anything? And I just kind of like, well, you can't. So you just got to be creative with when you do add analog to Atmos, which is fun. But sometimes we don't do that either. It's just purely digital, purely in the box.
Yep, which I think, Piper, is mostly how you mixed for Atmos as well, but you of course got an amazing analog stereo setup as well. Can you take us through a little bit of your studio build?
Certainly. I mean, this one that I'm in right here is my mastering. This is my mastering room. I've spent the last 4 years working under Infrasonic, but just recently reopened under my own business name here on my system. So it's just really just a brand change. But the system here is full stereo, but I have access to some studios in LA that I'm really excited about. I'll be working out of the PMC room in Highland Park at Lemon Tree, and then also I've been consulting and helping to build a facility in the East Bay area called Shiny Eyes Studio, and we'll have a 914 system out there.
That's awesome. Congrats on that. Let's talk a little bit about the process, what you're delivered from, either the producer or the mixer when you're approaching an Atmos mastering session. And, from there, sort of how you communicate back with them, the results along the way, and sort of how you're QCing. Dale, what are you receiving from either the mixer or the producer when they're coming to you for an Atmos master?
Typically, I'll receive the ADM BWF. It's the main export out of, and they'll be exporting out of Pro Tools or out of Logic, depending on their workflow. And most of the time, I'll be, importing that into Pro Tools for kind of a first set of processes, and then I'll finish off everything in the album assembler. Once in a while, we can go directly, as the album assembler they've been working so hard to add features and constantly refine that thing. It's a beautiful piece of software. I'm trying to use the album assembler more and more, just as a first and only step, and we're definitely getting more and more projects are going that way as well. So, typically we don't receive stems, but we do receive stems sometimes. Like once in a while, a client will finish the stereo in the 11th hour, and they'll be like, oh my gosh, we need an Atmos version, and we do that as well. Typically one of my engineers, Philly Filizola, does most of the mixing here, just because he's really good at it, and I just like to stay in the mastering workflow. So I'll work from stems when necessary, but we do a bit of mixing as well at our spot.
Yeah, that's cool. And so Piper, how are you QCing and then also sending back to the client for them to check? Are you checking headphone translation, using the binaural metadata settings, and then sending them back a file to check on their side?
Yeah, and so far I've mostly just been working on songs one at a time. I'm really excited. I have my first like actual full album coming in to be mastered in Atmos, so I'm excited to work on that next month. But on the renderer, but I'm excited to work on my first full album in the assembler next month. But the workflow so far has been I get an ADM or a Pro Tools session, and then load it into Pro Tools, play back, check the binaural, get that to the client. Usually they're listening in AirPods or something on the go, and so they're able to reference it and be happy with it, and then just upload the finished deliverables to ShareFile or file service. That's been working out pretty well. It's just, one song at a time so far. And even for that Madame Ghandi EP, it really was just one song every month or so until the album was completed. That's the funny thing about, a lot of the clients that I'm working with right now. They're so excited about working in this format that they're kind of shooting at the hip almost with the release. They're like, I'm not really sure how much the whole thing's going to cost, or they go through it and realize that it was actually a little easier to work in the format than they thought, and so they want to do the whole album in that. And so it's just kind of a little unplanned, and kind of having to pivot as we go. But yeah, it's kind of neat to see at least this album released in all formats and produced for all formats. So we had totally different mixes for the vinyl, the Atmos, and the stereo.
And what an amazing work it is. I had the pleasure of checking it out, and she's a drummer, right, but also a producer and a singer. So she's going into it with a couple of different hats on, and going into it thinking about an immersive experience in mind. It really did translate well and perfectly to Atmos. I thought, lots of very cool instrumentation, very percussive, snaking congos and vocal harmonies everywhere. Just really, really cool.
I've been really happy with the like for me, I spent a lot of time. I've spent a lot of time like checking out the tools and playing with the tools, and messing with old mixes that I had access to before I really felt like I was ready for prime time with a proper Atmos master. And it was a lot. I was a lot more confident than I thought I was going to be when I actually sat down to do my very first project in the tools. Like for some reason, I guess I hyped myself up so much more than it was necessary, because I just really wanted to do a good job. And this is an artist that I've worked with for so many years, and she's always had a lot of faith in me. But she was like, if you feel comfortable and you like it, great. And then we've gotten just amazing amazing feedback on the actual release of it. So it's kind of fun. I'm actually now I'm actually really excited. I have enough challenges in my in my business life. It's like, do I need to learn a whole nother thing? But it's actually really fun.
And the results are great. So well done. Looking forward to hearing more for sure.
I would just add, I totally agree with Piper. It was this huge, the ideas, sometimes stop people from just dipping their feet in and just seeing where their natural creativity takes them. And that was the same for me, Piper. It was like I sat down and I had this thing I had kind of produced with some friends, and I was just going to make an Atmos version of it. And I just spent, you know, I just spent 2 hours just being creative and having fun. And it was not at all as intimidating or it wasn't technical feeling. It was just fun because I had 4 walls and a ceiling to paint instead of, a canvas in front of me. So yeah, I love that experience, because sometimes people think, oh, it's just so technical, and it's really not.
I'm so rarely on the beginning or like the actual, beginnings of the creativity process with an artist, like especially now in being so rooted in vinyl manufacturing. I mean, it's like so little of my day is spent being creative and having fun with these tools in front of me. It's just like, okay, I got to get to work, I got to get this thing done, we're under a deadline, we got to figure this out, and that's its own challenge. But I always thought, for years I've always thought, okay, the fun in mastering, the challenge of mastering, the creativity of mastering is the fact that we have these limitations. These limitations of, we have 2 channels, or even, when I was working in 5.1 surround, right, we got 6 channels, and now it's like there's no channels to even think about. Like, you have everything you want to do, and it's just kind of fucky with my brain sometimes, because I'm like, creativity, like limitations make you more creative, but now we don't have these limitations, so what is creative anymore? It's just like, have some fun.
I love that. That's awesome. Um, Dale, you were talking a little bit about like the creative process and the experimentation side of things. And early on, you had done some mixing and mastering work in Atmos along with Jesse Ray on like the Doja Cat tracks, for example. What was that experience like specifically?
I feel blessed because, it was one of my earliest things, not one of like I was probably 30 or 40 things in by the time Doja needed Atmos only for a couple songs at first. And the you're right, Jesse's a beast. Like the source material already sounded good, so bringing in the stems and just playing it through the front 2 speakers, it sounded incredible. And it sounded, honestly, hearing full dynamic stems, it was just so exciting, compared to not the stereo master sounded good. Like in on the case of Woman, Mike Bozzi had mastered, the stereo, and it sounded good, but then I was being able to experience the stems, which, had 8 to 10 dB more dynamic range, just because, stereo music has to be loud, has to be competitive. And that's one of the beautiful things about Atmos, is it's not nearly as competitive in terms of volumes, and we get to deal with like true impact of drums and space and all these things. So it was just fun being able to hear. I mean, I can't say, I mean, I did, like on Woman, I did some creative panning. I spaced things out. I went back and forth between, I really wanted to nail both what it sounded like in the room, but also what it sounded like on headphones at the time, both binaural and otherwise. I wanted to check all those boxes. So the process really for me was more of a double checking. Once I got something I was happy with, which really didn't take that long because everything sounded great to begin with. It was more make small adjustments so that I could kind of like ease my way into balances that worked in all the formats, whether it be on speaker or headphones. Because sometimes there's different experiences of vocal level between where we are, and you think you nailed it on the speakers, and you listen on the headphones and you're thinking, oh, this feels a little, the vocal feels a little low, or maybe it feels a little bit more or less ambient than I thought it did. And just fine tuning between the different, just to land on something that translates as you want to everywhere is kind of where it was at for me. Although I will say, I wish I had the album assembler limiter at the time, because we didn't have the limiter when I did Doja, and I think I could have used that. Not just to make sure, because one of the things I've been really focusing in on is making sure that the you know even though minus 18 uh, integrated minus one peak is is the max of the format. I've been trying to just stay away from that a little bit, just from conversations I've been hearing on the different streaming platforms, how they normalize their music. It seems to be profitable to make sure that you give it a little bit more headroom than the minus one, so that the limiter helps me do that.
Nice. Yeah, range is important, right? So there's a little tip and trick for folks out there. And then you also worked on a couple of the biggest records of 2022, right? I mean, one that was recognized by the industry with a ton of awards, and rightly so, in Harry's House, and one that ended up on a lot of best of lists in SZA's SOS, which is an amazing record as well. What was your approach to the mastering phase in Atmos on those?
So those were I approached those a little bit differently. And with Harry's House, I wasn't involved on the stereo mastering side. So we were really trying to be preservative. Really, first I have to credit the crew at the Atmosphere, Mike Miller and John Castelli, who did these mixes. John's good friends with some of the people in the Harry's camp, and that's how we ended up being involved. And really what it was about in that case was making sure that we were just like Piper was saying earlier. It was about making sure things translate to manufacturing or to the real world, out in streaming. That's really what it was about, because Spike and Randy had made this. Spike mixed it and Randy mastered the stereo, and they had done this really amazing thing. And what we were trying to do is somehow preserve that character, somehow preserve what was resonating with everyone in the room, and have it translate in the Atmos format. So really, it was a lot of A-Bing between the mixes John and Mike had really beautifully done, and then going back and forth and getting really in the weeds in terms of like what I was hearing in the stereo, what I was hearing in the Atmos, and making sure that things were we I knew intuitively, and it turned out to be true, that they didn't want something in the Atmos to sound totally different than the stereo. It needed to sound and have the character, because that they nailed it there. We just needed an immersive version that was that could benefit from the extra dynamics and benefit from the extra space, but not necessarily having some sort of like DNA difference in the music. And then as for SOS, I mastered the stereo of that as well with Rob Bissell and a few other individuals, and the Atmos actually came through very quickly, and in the end, and Mike and John did those mixes as well. That was a little bit more of a creative process, because it was very fast, although we did get more creative, and we were a little less I wasn't making sure I didn't have some other thing to please other than what I thought needed to be done, which was really cool, because I wasn't worried about all the things I was worried about the Harry project on. So it was a little bit more creative, it didn't necessarily need to track with the stereo. It was and it was a different it was a different kind of music, so different textures, different spatial elements, different different writing styles. So two very awesome things that I'm very proud of, but they came about very, very differently.
That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, shout out to Mike and John for sure.
They're the greatest.
Yeah, man. Okay, we'll open it up to Q&A in a second, but I'm curious what's next for you both, if you can share a little bit. Piper, I mean, you're involved in so many wonderful projects. You do a lot of educational work and engagements out in the community. You're on the move in a lot of cities. What can you share with us about what's coming up and what we should look out for that you're involved in?
Well, I've been doing some work with a group called Equalize Her, which is co-founded by Alicia Ballard and Linda Perry. Also another group that Alicia is involved in with Kings Leon called Inherit the Music, just simply as a volunteer and an advisor right now, and speaking, doing presentations and stuff and education with them. But I'm really excited to see where those two organizations are going to go. We've got some upcoming women's audio mission programming happening. Vinyl, that my vinyl plant, we have a new effort called No Stupid Vinyl Questions, which is a tag on to the original No Stupid Audio Questions, which is a really cool little thing that we started in the pandemic. So tinystereo.com, and you can submit an anonymous question about pretty much anything you want. I mean, outside of that, I just trying to keep the world moving forward, making good records. It's a lot of work and a lot of time, but it's very rewarding. And then sometimes I get to do these cool things and speak to amazing people also doing great work. So
awesome. Thank you for sharing that, and congratulations on everything you've done and that you will continue to achieve, no doubt. Dale, I know you're working closely on evolving mastering tools for stereo and Atmos. You talked about the album assembler, and I think the last time I visited you, Becker Mastering looked like it was expanding a bit. What's coming up for you?
Gosh, we're up to two rooms now, which is really exciting. We've been just kind of trying to work with. We've been trying to continue to build in. For me, a passion of mine has always been to provide opportunity for folks, for aspiring engineers to have a place to come and work, to have a place to work for 5-10 years, develop your chops, and go out and do your own thing. I love that because of all the opportunities that were afforded me by others who did the same. So although I'm not involved as directly in education like Piper, I know we both share the passion for helping others and bringing others along. So that's I mean, if you're not, the saddest thing for me would be to live and die as only a mastering engineer. I want to help other people do the same, and make long-term friendships and relationships along the way. That's what it's about for me, is relationships and finding meaningful situations, both from a musical and a just family, friends point of view. So that's the kind of driving force behind why we're building and why we're making other rooms and why we're doing these things, is because it's difficult. It's difficult if you don't have rooms to put people in or put assistants in to run things, or if you don't have we have a couple rooms that are just kind of like stereo, and they're kind of like down and dirty, half treated rooms that we put interns in, and we're like, hey, master this, and give them a shot. So that's exactly that's kind of the driving force behind everything, and we're continually involved in releases that are coming. We're just, it's an exciting time, and I'm just very thankful.
Well, thank you, and thank you for sharing that, and thank you for everything that you do out there as well, and congratulations on everything you're doing and will continue to do. Thank you to both of my guests. With that, we will jump into Q&A. So put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will answer them here. Thank you.
All right, zap the QR code there on the screen to grab a free 90-day trial of the Dolby Atmos renderer. That, of course, combines what was the Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite and the Dolby Atmos Production Suite into one product, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. But you can check out the music community session we did with Jordan Glasgow, Finn Barnes, and John Kersey for a deep dive on that. And shout out to Jordan for all that he does out in the world as well. I'd like to welcome back Piper and Dale now. And we got a lot of questions rolling in. I will do my best to combine them when I can. I think there might be a little bit of overlap on some of them. So, and there may be some comments that you made earlier in our discussion that touch on some of these points, but we will do our best to get to as many of them as we can and roll through. So Kevin asks, can you discuss best practices for mixing workflows that set up mastering engineers for success? And Kevin, I assume, is referring specifically to mixing in Atmos before it's delivered to you, but I'm sure there are some best practices for stereo that come across as well. Piper, do you want to talk about best practices for mixing workflows that will set the mastering phase up for success?
Yeah. Well, for me as an engineer, it's always like labeling, it's organization, it's kind of clarity on what's being sent to me and what I should expect. It's really nice to get a list of what I should have. And that way that, me and my assistant can check it against what we actually have, and then deal with any discrepancies before the day of the session. That's just best practices for any type of collaborative work. And then expectations for the finished master is always awesome to have. If there's a reference or something that somebody has for me that I can use and get the closest to what their vision is early on, that's kind of the best of all worlds for everybody. I did notice, early on in working with the format, like it was kind of hard sometimes to figure out what I had. I had to constantly go back through and reorganize everything. And I'm sure Dale knows this too, but as mastering engineer, I'm used to just getting a 2-track mix, a stereo mix over and over and over again. And so at some point I can kind of decode what it is. And it's been a lot of years since I was working in the like the multi-track and mixing format outside of just stem mastering. So it was kind of an exercise in patience and organization for me to have to go back through and figure out, like, okay, is this a kick drum or a tom? Is this a this or a this? And then organize it myself. So it's definitely been a patience exercise for me. So anything you can do to help your engineer just know what's what, that's always a good start.
Yeah, and Dale, your take on best practices, maybe for Atmos mixing to set up the mastering phase for success.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Previously in stereo, there wasn't as many technical details that mixing engineers needed to know. But with label quality control and with streaming requiring pretty stringent specific things when it comes to Atmos, it's really important that the mixing engineer is well aware. Even certain things, like certain labels don't want a vocal only in the center channel, because obviously someone could just plug a cable into the receiver and rip off a vocal. So if you send a mix that doesn't meet a standard like that, and I can't really master it and meet the quality control that meet those specific guidelines. So the mixing engineers really need to be well aware of where just standard procedure, but also where is it headed? Is it headed to Universal? Is it headed to Sony? And there are the things that they require that we'll need to check those boxes, as well as just really making sure that, I think it's super important to be, as we discussed earlier, making sure that it's translating the way that you want it to, both on speakers and in headphones. A lot of times people try these kind of like grand, you'll see tambourines, figure eights, and shakers, all these kind of like fun things in the room. And then you put on a headphone and a pair of headphones, you're like, this is not exactly the experience that I want to deliver to the world, So making sure that we're listening in all the places where people will be listening, to make sure that we don't have to deconstruct much in the mastering phase. Mastering in Atmos, really it's the final 5%, not a we're not. It should be a relatively simple process. So just making sure that the mix translates. It's very difficult, all that to say, it's very difficult to make broad sweeping mix changes in the mastering phase in Atmos.
Yeah, and I think you just gave a great example of a question that Elliot asks, and that is, are you finding in some cases that mix engineers are too extreme and looking to do too much, and in that case you've had to send things back to them? I know you work with some amazing mix engineers, so it's probably not that often, but have you ever found that these types of things are too extreme and you've had to kind of send them back?
I don't think I've had people ask my opinion and I say it and then they're like, let me send you another mix. I've never had to send something back. And it's kind of funny because a lot of people mix because the renderer is so cool, you know, it has all the little objects moving around. A lot of times things can look really complex, but to our ear, our brain is, you know, reducing everything down to something that we understand. So a lot of times people get thrown off. They're like, man, the objects are moving around a lot. Is this too complex? And it's like, well, what do you hear? You know, a lot of times things can look complex in a session, but sound really natural. And I think that it's just kind of a you know, analogous to our experience in the world when we're in a room of musicians. You know, things are there's so much complexity, there's so much noise, there's so much everything, and our brain does a wonderful job of reducing it down to something that we either like or we don't like. And yeah, I would just make sure to not to enjoy the object display, but not to mix with your eyes.
Great, thank you. And hopefully that answers some of the questions that Robert, Sierra, Jack have submitted, and Ryan as well. Ryan, I know you have a couple of others in there that we'll try to get to as well. But I do want to go down to one that Jonathan asked. How much analog processing do you use in your Atmos mastering process? If you do, are there any favorite pieces that you like to use?
Piper, you want to go first, or?
None.
Yeah, for the most part, none, but I am moving more toward, mainly for the fun of it. We have a Neve Genesis console that has AES in and AES out and its own ADC and DAC. So I've spent quite a bit of time and money getting it to where, because it's also very difficult to, when you have a Pro Tools system and you have 128 channels, typically you need 2 HDX cards and that you need those 128 channels for Atmos. So if you want to add analog processing on top of that, you need a third HDX card, more IO. It's pretty expensive. I was, and I guess I was crazy enough to do it. I just wanted to see what it would be like to use a console and use tube gear and use, analog inserts. And it is a lot of fun, and when you come across a project, that really deserves that sort of, that needs it and deserves it, it's a lot of fun to be able to get a little bit of additional tone, in the Atmos, in the Atmos workflow. Because a lot of times, the stereo was mixed on a console, and you might get that sound in the stems, but we lack the analog pass of the stereo master, which was probably worked on a very fine desk, a nice tube gear or whatnot, and implementing some of that sound back into the Atmos can be the thing that kind of bridges the gap between the stereo and the Atmos. But it's not totally necessary at all. I mean, I've done hundreds of totally in the box Atmos, masters and mixes, and that sounds really, really good.
Great, thank you. Simon asked, do you use different speaker brands for mastering stereo versus Atmos in the same room? Piper, or you want to jump in?
Well, different, I mean, it's all the same brand. I prefer PMC speakers. But, there's nothing to say that, I couldn't have a pair of, Dunlavies or something as the stereo, and then the PMCs as the Atmos speakers. But, I think same speaker brand across all your speakers is pretty smart. And also, there are systems that are set up that, the speaker company will help you set up a whole system that's, that's appropriate for your room and your workflow. So I think it's important to at least confer with whomever is, going to be your speaker brand.
Yeah, I'm a big PMC. I'm a lifelong live and die PMC. That's the speaker for me. It is good. I will say this, a lot of times mastering, especially in the stereo world, we check it on multiple, and I think that's where the question originates from, is that we we check on many different kinds of speakers. You know, you'll have your main PMC rig, and then maybe you'll have you know, like a pair of Cali Audios or different speakers and headphones, and that experience can still happen in Atmos. A lot of times I like to check. I have a pair of just some off-brand speakers in the corner that are set up in stereo, and I will listen to the stereo re-render of the Atmos I'm working on, or I'll go and listen in the car. I'll listen, you know, I might listen through an iPhone and spatial, and then I'll go and I'll listen to the straight binaural stereo file, you know, and checking in all these places just helps my brain make sure I'm hearing it. Different experiences of Atmos will help me realize the little nuances that need to be tweaked. Oh, there's a little bit too much. One of the things that happens a lot is, you know, you'll have this great emotional dynamic mix in the room, and then you'll take it into the car and realize the kick drum's like 4 dB too loud for a consumer system, you know, because our PMCs can handle a giant kick drum, but maybe, you know, crappy car speakers can't. So making sure that your mix translates, you know, even in, you know, not good environments, I think is very important.
Great, thanks. One from Jonathan here. Dale, do you master the individual objects and bed channels from the ADM mix, or do you master off the render or returns in your session?
Typically what I'll do is I'll import the ADM into Pro Tools or into the if I need to do object specific things, that still has to be done in Pro Tools. So say for instance, if I'm listening down to the ADM and I realize, you know, the vocals on this album could really benefit from the Weiss soft tube Weiss de-esser plugin, just to, you know, control it, because nothing's worse. You know, essing is bad in stereo, but if you have essing in Atmos, it's immersive essing. You know, it's you know, essing everywhere. So really controlling the S's on an object, that's something that I do all the time. Or sometimes you'll be listening down and you'll hear, you know, clicks and pops on an acoustic guitar track that were removed in the stereo version, but for some reason that didn't happen in the stems. You know, you'll have to do all of that work within Pro Tools currently.
Thanks. We've had a lot of questions about plugins, actually. Susan and Jesse and a few others. Any plugins that have changed your life? Any that are just favorites or that you use frequently?
Go ahead, Dale.
A lot of people are using, I'm sorry if I mess up the name, but the Hornet plugin. It's kind of like, it provides you with limiting and compression within Pro Tools. But typically I try to reserve those processes for the album assembler, just because I really like the sound of the album assembler. But the Hornet plugin is very cool. I think one of the things that I found out really early when more in the mix mode is that you don't necessarily need immersive plugins for immersive mixing. Like I spent a lot of unnecessary money on immersive reverbs, you know, because I was getting kind of nerdy and I was just wanting immersive everything. And I just realized sometimes it's way cooler to take the UA, you know, capital plates and put it in the back, you know, a stereo reverb in the back, you know. So a lot of times I end up using my favorite stereo plugins, and don't necessarily need, and even in cases like the bed, like all the FabFilter stuff, you don't need an immersive version, because you can slap Pro L or Pro Q directly on the bed, or you can strap it. You know, one of the things that I do in mastering is I'll have, you know, if there's 100 channels, I'll have 100 Pro Qs up and down my Pro Tools session, all in the same insert path, and have those all linked, so that when I'm making a broad sweeping you know, EQ change, it'll be happening to the whole mix. Same thing, you could use side chains with compression to you know, up and down, and side chain all the compressors to the stereo mix, which is really cool, because then you get the pump the, you know, the pump and the rhythm and the feel of the stereo in your immersive master.
Any favorite plugins, Piper? Maybe stereo mastering plugins or things that you use in Atmos?
I use a lot of the stereo mastering, or you know, one channel instance style plugins. Like I found a lot of use out of Fab Filter stuff, but I found that I didn't really have to do as much processing as I thought I was going to have to. And anytime I started adding too much, I could tell almost immediately that it was too much. And I found that, you know, like a simple EQ here and there was a bus compressor that I was using for a while. I can't remember the name of it. I feel like it might have been Hornet. But that, for some reason, it wasn't doing exactly what I needed it to do, so I stopped using it. But yeah, I found a lot of use out of the Fab Filter plugins in Pro Tools.
Yeah, very popular. Thank you. All right, we've got time for one more question, and thank you so much to everybody that submitted your questions. I'll do my best to get back to you on those via email. But in terms of, again, best practice in delivery to you, Pascal asks, if I'm mixing to -18, should I mix to a lower level to give you more headroom before I deliver to you?
Not necessarily. As long as you're not clipping, you know, bed channels, which is very hard. You basically would have to have all the channels going through left and right and just jamming it in there. But typically we can, as long as there isn't, you know, baked in distortion into the mix, you can really send it at any level and leave mastering to set the final level.
Yeah, just like in stereo. I mean, if you're working at least 24-bit WAV files, you have lots and lots of headroom. There's no real reason to jam it up into the last little tiny bit at the top.
Awesome, thank you. Many thanks to Piper and Dale for all of their amazing wisdom and input on this. Thank you so much to everybody that submitted questions. Again, we had so many that we couldn't even get to them, but wonderful comments and questions there. So with that, we'll end, and thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.